Hello there and welcome to this Adobe Illustrator Basics tutorial. If you are a beginner to Adobe Illustrator, then this one's for you. If you're not a beginner, it's probably not for you. There'll be other tutorials for you. But if you're just starting out, this is going to be a great way for you to get to know all of the tools, tips and tricks that will help you create wonderful vector artwork. So without further ado, let's get into what we're going to cover on the course. We're going to create documents, we're going to learn about layers, we're going to learn about all these tools here, we're going to learn about strokes, brushes, fills, and plenty of other objects and effects you can use to create awesome vector artwork. You may want to know what kind of artwork can you make? Things like this, and I'm going to show you how we make things like this. I'm also going to show you exactly how we create these kind of effects. I probably won't illustrate the full thing, I don't want to be here all year, but we'll get into how these are made so that you can start making your own wonderful artwork. So without further ado, let's get into it. Creating a document. There's only a few things you need to know. So say we go to File, New to create a document, or we open Illustrator to create a document. We have web, we have print, film, video, art and illustration. The two we're going to focus on are web and print and what the difference between the two things are. So if we make a document that is made for web, it will be in an RGB color profile and it will be 72 dpi. This means that if this is illustrated to be seen on a mobile or website, it's going to look exactly as it should. Now the difference is if you design this for web, it's not going to be fit for print. It's going to have a different color profile and probably be smaller than it needs to be. So we also have print here, which is measured in millimeters, and this is done in a CMYK color profile at 300 dots per inch. It doesn't matter if you know what these terms mean, but just know that if you want to print something, you're probably going to need to create a print document, and you can probably also want to look at maybe adding some bleed and crop marks here because printers like to have crop and bleed on their documents. Web is where we're starting today, 1920 by 1080. If I click create, I would create that document. I can have it portrait or landscape. For this, I've got it landscape. So let's say I created it, it would make a new document, but I've already done that, so I don't need to. So here we are, that's how you create a document. So now I'm going to get into layers, what layers are and how we use them. So as you can see here, I have layers. What does that mean? Well, a layer means we can place something below or above another thing. So don't worry about drawing anything right now, but say I create a circle and I make a black circle like so. This is now on this corresponding layer, and we can see that in the thumbnail here. So if we wanted to delete that layer, we can use this little delete button here. If we want to create a new layer that's blank, we just click this create new layer button, or if we want to duplicate this layer, we can drag it down to that create new layer and it will duplicate it for us. That now means we have two separate layers that are above and below each other. So if I click on the circle below on layer 9, I can do that by selecting this because I can't see it at the moment as there's another circle above it, and I change that to red. You'll see in the corresponding thumbnail here there is now a red circle. This means it's below the black circle, and I can show you that by dragging this black circle, and you'll see how it's in front of the red circle. We can reorder layers, so if I want to pull the black circle below the red, you'll see it's now above and below. So this means that if I have something that is filled and I want to put something on top of it, for instance a brush stroke in a specific color like black, then I can draw over the top of it or I can draw underneath it depending on what it is I am trying to do. We'll get more into that as we go on, but let's start at the top first of all. So we've got a basic circle, and the first thing we're going to talk about is the selection tools, because now we're getting into the tools. As you'll see on here, tools is next. So let's do tools. So with the tools, this is your basic selection tool. You can press V to select that, or you can just click here. This allows you to drag and move things around. It allows you to resize things. You can hold shift while you drag, and that will maintain the constraints and proportions of your circle. You can also hold alt, and that will scale from center. You can hold alt and shift, which will scale proportionately from center like so. And we can drag this around, we can move it, and all that good stuff. So that's your basic selection tool. Then we have what is called the direct selection tool. This allows us to select little bits that aren't just the object. We can select the object, sure, but we can also select things and delete them, like paths, by selecting a path point here, we could click delete and that will just delete that entire path. Or we can also click on the path, move it in, move it out. We can change these Bezier points, drag them up and down. Because I've held Alt, it's duplicated, but we'll get into that later also. So as you can see, this is for selecting points and editing them after you've drawn them, as well as a bunch of other stuff. We also have the lasso selection tool, which can be used in a similar way to the direct selection tool, except you're just selecting whatever the lasso goes around. So that would select this entire point, and then I can use the direct selection tool to then move it. This is useful if you had multiple different points and you want to select them all. You could use this, do so, and just select all of these points along here. Or you can use the direct selection tool, draw a rectangle and do the same thing. So very useful, and we will get into how we can utilize that once we start drawing more stuff. We also have a magic wand tool, which is similar to Photoshop, just selecting everything for you there on that layer with the magic wand tool. So now we're going to get into the really interesting stuff, probably the most important stuff, which is the tools for creation and drawing, the pen tool, the brush tool, the pencil tool, the shape creation tools. So we have the pen tool. This is one that it's going to take you time to master, but once you perfect it, wow, can you do some great stuff with it. So clicking adds an anchor point. Clicking again would add another anchor point. Because I made them in a straight line, I get a straight line. If I want a curve, I click and hold. This creates what is called a Bezier handle. That's this diagonal line that you see here. I can hold shift and make sure that stays at a right angle, or I can have a freeform Bezier point that will allow me to adjust the curve. As we said before, you can use the direct selection tool after the fact to change these points if you're not happy. Now we can use the pen tool to do multiple things, like create closed shapes that are in any form. You might say, well, what's that you've just drawn? Well, it could be a whale, literally. I don't even know how, but now it's a whale. A red whale? No, a blue whale. Maybe he's got a mouth. And you see, just as easy as that, we've created some kind of poorly drawn whale. So the point is, the pen tool can be used to create a multitude of different shapes and curves, and it's just by clicking and dragging and changing these Bezier handles and these points that we've created, we can create all sorts of multitudes of shapes and new things. You are not limited by anything here but your imagination, and in my case that means I'm very limited. So that is an extremely important tool, and we'll get into more with the examples. Right click, transform, reflect tools. This can be very useful, but we'll get into that later. So that's the pen tool. Okay, you may not see the curvature tool. If you can, it's probably because you've got a plugin like me, but if you haven't got this plugin, you're not going to see these extra ones. So let's just stick to the basics. We've got the type tool here. That pretty much does what it says on the tin. We click and we can type text like tutorial for Illustrator. Then we can take that text and we can use our selection tool to move it around. Much like a shape, we can hold shift and scale it, or not hold shift and scale it, but we don't do that very often because we want to keep our proportions. We can double click and select all our text. Up here we can change our font to something else. We can change whether we want it bold if you have a font family with different weights, and we can also click character here, and this will allow you to adjust other things, like for instance, let's take our text and put it on 2 lines. We have the leading, which creates space between the top and bottom lines of text here. We have the adjustment between the characters, so we can expand between or retract the space between characters, the kerning, or we can increase the font size from here, as well as adjust things like rotation of each individual character and things like that. Some of these you'll use more than others, like the kerning, like the line spacing, and obviously the size of characters. At all times, if you've done anything and you want to undo it, you can press Ctrl Z or undo, and that will then regress through your type or whatever changes you've made. For some reason mine's not doing it. right now as far as I'd like, but there you go. So you've learnt about the type tool, how to set fonts and how to change those settings. So that's pretty cool too. Now we're going to move on to the line segment tool. This is simply a tool to draw lines, and then once these lines are drawn, we could obviously add strokes, or we can add strokes beforehand. And once we create multiple lines like so, we can connect them after the fact if we want by grabbing two of them, bringing them together, selecting both those points, right click, join, and now these are one path. Alternatively, we can just use the pen tool, hold shift, draw, look for our guide points and draw a rectangle that way. But if you just want to draw a line, that's how you do it. We can also adjust the thickness of the stroke up here. We can also adjust the uniformity of the stroke, and we can change the brush types, but we'll get more into that when we talk about brushes and strokes later on. We can also create different various shapes based on pre-made shapes like rectangles, rounded rectangles, ellipses, polygons, and the star tool and the flare tool, which I don't use very much, but I can show you what it does. This is just a quick way to draw various different rectangles with the rectangle tool. They can be filled any color you like. They can have strokes. We can also create rounded rectangles like so. Another option is to click within a regular rectangle that you've drawn, click and hold these little circle points here and drag, and then you will create from a regular rectangle a rounded rectangle where you can adjust the curves as much as you like. You can also select a single point and just one curve individually to create another shape like that. You could then, I suppose, hold Alt, drag while clicking to duplicate this same shape over, reflect, vertical, click again, hold Alt, drag down, transform, reflect, horizontal, and we've made a little grid like that. Just that easy. So we also have obviously the ellipse shape for creating an ellipse or a circle, the polygon tool. Thing to note about the polygon tool is that if you hold shift, you'll get a regular polygon drawn on the exact right angle of its axes, but you can also release, rotate it how you like. You can also use the directional arrows on your keyboard to increase the number of sides on your polygon and make various different shapes that way. Similarly, when we use the star tool, we can drag this out and then we use the directional arrows on the keyboard to give it more or less points on the star. We can also hold shift and we can also hold Alt, and Alt will allow us to create these thicker, wider shapes, or we can hold Control and drag and we get these wider star shapes or shorter star shapes also. So Alt allows me to shift between the two, but holding Control means I can have more control over these points and how large or small they are. For instance, holding, I can make a shape like that, or I can come in and make a shape that's more like this. I can also I can convex and concave, so you can see there's lots of ways we can use the star symbol shape. We don't have to click and drag. We can also have more control by double clicking and choose how many points we want, and the radius points 1 and 2 will show the depth of the star shapes that protrude. So that's another way of creating star shapes. So there's your shape tools, and now we're going to go on to the brush tools, and it's at this point I'm probably going to start getting more into strokes and the difference between strokes. So previously with the line tool, with the shape tool, or with the pen tool, we create shapes. These shapes can be curved, they can be straight, it doesn't matter, but what is a constant is we have fills and strokes. We can have no fill and stroke and it will all be completely transparent. We can have no fills, so now there's nothing inside but there is a line on the outside, or we can have both. And what that means is we can change the strokes and the fills and utilize those in various different ways. So let's get into that. So let's say I have an example where I've used the pen tool. and I want to change the stroke into, like I said before, something more interesting perhaps, we can make it thicker. And we can also change things in here, so we can have round caps, and as you'll see, round caps will round out these points here. We also have round corners, so that means that if I had a square angle like so, and I put round caps on, it will round out the edge at this point here, rather than having it be a sharp point. As you can see, it just changes. We also have the bevel join, which is kind of a flat edge, which I don't use as much. We can also use this here, the dashed line box. If we tick that, this doesn't look very dashed, but that's because of the settings and the weight. But as we come down and create more spacing between the dashes, you can see that we can change the settings on both, so we can have longer dashes with larger gaps or shorter gaps, and so on. So you can see how we can use that dashed line tool there to create some interesting stroke effects. And we also have arrowheads here. If you want to add an arrowhead to one of the points, that can be quite useful for maps and pointing towards things with a dotted line and an arrowhead, if that's what you want. We can also change uniformity. So say we want to have something that starts thin, gets thicker, and ends thin, we can choose this uniformity. We can have different variation in the strokes. There's another way to create variation using the width tool, which we'll get into later, which can be useful for having more control over widths of strokes. But these presets can allow you to create quite interesting variation in your strokes. We also similarly have basically pre-made strokes that we can try with different brushes, which will create whole different styles and whole different strokes. And we don't just have this one default brush here. If we go to this little button up in the top right, open brush library, and then we have a plethora of different brushes here for different things, like borders, like paint brushes, that come just as default with Adobe Illustrator. So say we go to artistic and paintbrush, we can have a selection of painted style strokes that we can use, and we can adjust the thickness of the stroke still, even though it's a different style, and we can have it thicker and thinner. If at any time you want to take that stroke and turn it into a fill, you can go to object and expand appearance. We'll get more into objects later, but now that is no longer necessarily a stroke, it's now an object. So rather than it being this editable stroke line, it's now a fill, which means I can adjust it as a fill as opposed to adjusting it as a stroke necessarily. So you have a lot of different brushes in that library to play with, whether you're using the pen tool or you're using shapes. You're drawing shapes like so, and you want to give it a stroke. I can put any stroke I like on the outside of that. You can also see I can use the ink dropper tool to copy both the fill and stroke of a pre-existing setting. So that's copying the dashed lines we created over here. This is copying that stroke, but it's not adding the uniformity or the brush or anything like that. So you might need to come in, choose the uniformity you want again in those instances, and you can also add specific brushes like this and see what mad effects those create. So there you go. We've learned something about strokes there, about dashed lines, about stroke variation. Now we're going to get into the brush tool. The brush tool, similar to using your pen tool, except it's more freehand. I can literally just draw on with my mouse. Now, you may find this useful in various different ways. If you've got a graphics tablet, it's going to be very useful for you doing illustration in various different styles, but also just using your mouse, it can be useful for creating more organic freeform shapes with your mouse. You can also click after the fact and change the settings on any of these strokes just in the same way that you would when you draw a line, or use your pen tool. Another key thing to note if you are using a tablet is that you can use pressure variation by just going down here and clicking this little button again in the top right. Instead of going to libraries, we're going to create a new brush, calligraphic brush, OK, and this will allow us to create a brush of our own. We can add the angle and the roundness in varying different settings, but the one we'd look at if we wanted pressure variation with a tablet is here, where we want to click this drop down, go to pressure, change the variation to be the same as the size, and that gives us a brush that will go from 0 to 9 pt depending on the pressure used. So you may not have a tablet, that may not be of use to you, but if you have got a tablet, then yeah, it can be quite useful. So that is the brush tool. The pen tool, the pencil tool is also something we're going to get into now. The pencil tool is similar to the brush tool in a sense, because you can freehand draw your vector paths, which then obviously you can add your fills and strokes to. The difference with the pencil tool is there's a couple of things. If you draw a path with the pencil tool, you can then redraw that path and it will connect points for you. So if I draw from there, you can see it was this shape, but because I've redrawn a section, it joins and adjusts accordingly. This can be useful if you've drawn a shape and you don't like a single part, but you like most of it, and you want to just cut into it. You can redraw that path. It can be noted that it also works on other things as well. So for instance, if I want to draw something here, I can connect those 2 points using the pencil tool rather than just the pen tool. Similarly, if I've drawn with the pencil tool, I can use the pen tool, connect the pencil tool. Doesn't matter, just different ways and techniques of drawing your vector paths, but they can all be useful in different ways, as we'll get into when we get into style. We also have the eraser tool. Generally, it's not as useful as you'd like it to be, because if you have something like this with a stroke that you've applied an effect to and you use it, you can see it kind of changes your uniformity, but it does split it into two shapes, so that can be useful in some ways also. So there you go, that's the eraser tool, the pencil tool, and the majority of the drawing tools. A lot of that is the main stuff you're going to want to know when creating stuff. And when we get more into techniques, strokes, fills, all of this will make more sense as to how we use them, but you need to know the basics of these things before we can get on to the more advanced stuff. So right now we're going into a few tools here. Most of them you might not need to know. I'll do my best to show you all the ones I think you need to know the most. So the rotate tool, you can get to this by just having a selection and pressing R, or right click and transform rotate. Will also allow you to rotate using specific settings with a preview, but it'd probably be better not to show you rotation on a circle because you're not going to see much. But obviously if you want to rotate it, you can use the rotation tool to rotate. You can also press, I think it's E. Yeah, E is the one that brings up the transform tool. So if you press E, you can rotate, scale, and free transform. So that's what this is. So you've got the rotate tool just for rotation if you don't want to transform anything. But then you've also got the free transform tool. So that allows you to both scale and rotate. Then you've got the scale tool that just scales. So you get the idea of what they do. Another interesting one to note is the width tool. The way the width tool works is if you've drawn yourself a stroke anywhere, you can click and drag and you can make it thinner or you can make it thicker. And the reason this is really good is if you're doing illustration and you create a curve for, say, let's just create a cartoon nose and give it, oh gosh, right. Say you create like a cartoon nose like this and you want to have some variation, some line weight, you can just click and drag and there you go, the thicker point is now here, so it seems that like this is closer to the person taking a look. So that's how you can use the width tool, which is a really useful one when you're illustrating if you want to add some line variation. We also have the shape builder tool. This allows you to sort of interpolate between two shapes. So if I grab the shape builder tool and I use it to go between these two shapes, it creates a kind of almost an in-between shape. Sometimes it's better if they're connected. Grab the shape builder tool and then you see it combined those two shapes there, just to show you again sort of how that works. If I have one shape like so and another shape that is not the same, it can be different like that, and I select both, grab the shape builder, and it combines those two things and creates one specific shape from those two things. And again, if it's further apart, you'll have a different effect come from that as well. Oh yeah, okay, well don't work then. I don't use it that much, as you can see, but it can be useful for multiple shapes as well, is I think what I was trying to achieve. Click that, drag through, and there you go, you're getting this kind of multi-shape thingy, like it could be a key. Not with that stroke, because it's too thick. So we turn that down, maybe it's a key shape, you know, and now we've got a terrible key. So there you go, that's the shape builder. So there you go, these tools around here: rotate, scale, width tool to adjust the width of your strokes, free transform to let you do most of what the rotate and scale does, and then the shape builder tool that allows you to do some interesting stuff between different shapes. That also works for stuff you've created with the pen tool, as well as stuff created with the shape tool. So never think that you are in any way held back, because you can do it with both. So anyway, there's some more stuff. What have we got here? Mesh tool, gradient tool, blend tool, eyedropper tool. See, this is what happened before. I thought I was using the blend tool, but I wasn't. But we'll get into that. So mesh tool. Why would we use the mesh tool? Well, that might not make much sense, you know, when I click and create this mesh, but what it allows me to do is create a mesh on top of it that I can use to adjust the thing below it. A better way to maybe show you an example of that would be if I wanted to create something in perspective, and I go to object, like, what's it called? Perspective, envelope distort. You can make it with a mesh, or you can make it with a warp. So if you use the mesh tool, you create a mesh, you can attach that mesh to a shape, and then it will assign the value, the values, sorry. Or you can make warp, and this is like showing you how a mesh assigned to a shape can create different effects, different perspectives. So say you needed something to go against a wall and it's curving a little bit or something like that. This can be a useful way to put a photograph against something in perspective. You can also go to object, envelope distort, and you can make it with your own individual mesh that you create. And it's the same as if you assigned it. You can create this mesh and adjust the points, drag them out, and it creates different shapes based on a mesh and how you adjust that mesh shape. So that's meshes. So then we have the gradient tool. Now you also have a gradient layer here that allows you to adjust gradients. If you can't see this or any of the things that are over this side, not this, because that's a plugin, but the basic stuff here, it's all visible through here. So if I go to window, I can get my artboards up, I can get my brush libraries up, but what we're looking for right now is gradients. Mine are already up, but if you click this, you'll see a gradient. If you click on the gradient fill, it fills it with a gradient. We can then change the colors that correspond here to be a specific gradient. We can just click and add another color, add another gradient, and that will create a different effect, as you can see. So this means we can do a lot of things with gradients. The gradient tool is there to adjust the gradient by hand if you would like. You can change these settings over here, or you can use this gradient tool so we can change the angle here, as you can see, or where the specific points land. So that can be useful for creating all kinds of different gradient effects at different angles and good stuff like that. Obviously we can also adjust in here. We can also click into, say, this yellow and make it 0, which makes it completely opaque in the center. And that means if we draw underneath, we'll still have this gradient over the top, but whatever we've changed to 0 opacity or 50% opacity, whatever you want, that will be partly transparent. So that's your gradients and your gradient tool. Your eyedropper tool, well, that should be pretty self-explanatory by now, but if you don't know about eyedroppers, what that means is whatever values I've assigned to something else, whether that's fills, strokes or gradients, it doesn't matter. I can use the eyedropper to pull the exact same gradient into a shape, or vice versa, as you can see. So it's just a really quick way to copy, fill and layer styles without having to recreate them by hand, which is super useful. We then have what we call the blend tool. So the blend tool is partly what I was thinking about before, but the blend tool allows you to, for instance, blend shapes together in unique ways. So let's just say we've got some different shapes that we've made, like so, and we're going to grab them all. We're going to grab the blend tool. If we have these different shapes, we can click on the shapes, grab this blend tool, click one, click the other, and then click again, or click from there to here. And what that does is gives us a different effect depending on what I click. But what it's doing is it's creating an interpretation between shapes, and then it's giving us a unique shape that comes somewhere in between the two. So in this instance, between the star shape and the circle, if I click from there to there, we get this kind of curved star shape. But if I click from here to the rectangle, it's giving me the interpretation of what comes between the star shape and the rectangle to create this in the center, which is neither a rectangle nor a star, but something created from both. And then we can expand that if we want to create them again into separate shapes. Right click, ungroup if we want to move them separately. But that means that we can easily create shapes from two shapes that are fairly unique and different using the the blend tool. So there we go. Symbol sprayer tool. This is where we're probably going to get into the swatch libraries a little bit, and things like that, because with the swatch libraries you can have certain ones like flowers, going into nature flowers, and that brings up specific colors, but you can also have different textures and symbols. So if we go into textures and then we go into the textures library, we can see different textures for various different things. And if we click flowers here, rather than just having colors, because it's a symbol, we have these pre-built flower symbols. We can just click on these symbols, these pre-built symbols, drag them out, and it creates a vector for us that we can use in our illustrations or images free of charge. But we can also use the symbol sprayer tool, and we can spray multiple objects on. So say we're creating a meadow, of some grass with like a rectangle that is some shade of green. We could add a grass texture to that, or a gradient, and then we could add flowers above it and create a flower garden, that kind of thing. And there's not just flowers, obviously. We have various different stuffs, whether that is floral patterns, whether that's artistic textures. There's all sorts of good free stuff that you can use in your illustrations to create interesting effects with symbols and your libraries. So there you have it for the spray tool. Let's get on to the column graph tool. I'm not going to spend ages on the column graph tool, but it's useful if you're going to create infographics, because you can create bespoke graphs with varying different inputs. So I can change all the increments and stuff on the graph using this action in it, and as you can see, by inputting these different values, I can adjust this graph myself, and that can be very useful for creating multiple different kinds of graphs very quickly. It's not just used for creating graphs. When you click and hold, there are other tools to take note of, such as the bar graph tool, so it's a different kind of graph. You can have a line graph like so. So let's just input some random values. Obviously your values would be legit, but it'll create a line graph for us. We can also make pie charts that way, and adjust the pie charts in varying different similar ways. So useful if you want to create see how I've created 3 different ones with different values here, how I've created 3 segments in this one. We can then, if we wanted, go into object and paths, object and expand the appearance of the graphs. And nope. I want to go to expand appearance, but it's not letting me. Object expand object, expand appearance. Don't know why that's not allowing it. Never mind. Anyway, you get the idea. I think it's because I created 3, perhaps, but I'm sure if I created 1, I could expand the appearance. Did I expand the appearance? No, never mind. Anyway, so that's how you can create pie charts, graphs. Now, these tools, as I say, they're an extra plugin, Vector Scribe, Ink Scribe, all that. You won't have that most likely. That's a whole other tutorial. It doesn't come as a standard. The other things to note here are the hand tool down here, and what this allows you to do is, say you're zoomed in creating some wonderful artwork of some kind, not like this obviously, but actually wonderful. You can use the hand tool to drag the canvas around like that, or you can hold spacebar to automatically select it. The zoom tool, fairly self-explanatory. You can press Control minus or Control plus, or use the zoom tool. And you can also use this, which is the artboard tool. So if you want to adjust your artboard, you've got the position up here, you've got the width, you've got the height, and you can move these handles in and create a different artboard after the fact. So say you just wanted it to be the size of the piece of artwork we've created, we can drag these handles in to have it that size, or we can also click this drop down here, fit to artwork bounds, and whatever the artwork bounds are that you're selecting, for instance this, it will constrain it to that, or you can fit to selected art, sorry, so that would fit to this because that's what's selected. But if there's, you know, anything outside of that and you select the other one, fit to artwork bounds, it'll fit to whatever's in the boundaries of the work area. So there you go. That's pretty much all your tools there. We've got through the tools. That's the hard part. Well, it's not the hard part. It's not hard. It's just a lot of tools just to get through and to show you the basics of what they do. So now that we've gone through the tools, I'm going to cover a few things on effects on this objects tab up here, and I'm going to cover the Pathfinder, and then we can get into some of the examples and what we're going to make with these examples. So without any further ado, let's start with the Pathfinder, which is a very useful tool in several ways. It's not going to take us long to go over, but it is going to involve shapes. So say we have shapes, lots of shapes. We can do various different things with this, and I will show you now how that works. Let's start with 4 here of these different shapes. So what we've got are various different settings in shape modes and pathfinders. We have unite, minus front, intersect, exclude, divide, trim, merge, crop, outline, and minus back. These all do different or similar things, but let's start with the top 4. So we've got unite. If we select 2 shapes and click unite, the 2 shapes are then united into one. This is the same as using merge over here. Slightly different, but the same. So merge and unite combine shapes. Then we have minus front. That will remove the section that is in front. So if you have this layer in front of this layer, I select both and I click minus front, the front is now gone. The same as if I brought the circle to the front rather than the back by right clicking, arrange and bring to front, or you can send it to back, and this only works if they're in the same layer groups all together within that layer. We can then remove the circle, instead. So that's how we remove front. We can intersect, and that will mean that the integer in the middle of the 2 shapes is the only thing left, or we can exclude, which then does the reverse of that. The integer is the bit that vanishes and becomes transparent. So we also have the pathfinders. We have divide. What divide does is creates cuts wherever the paths meet. So now these are all separate shapes as opposed to 2 individual shapes overlapping. That can be a very useful tool indeed. We also have trim, and trim's just going to trim stuff off. We've obviously gone over merge, and we have crop, which is going to crop the integer. So now that is cropped, and we have outline, which will just turn these into an outline. So that's useful if you've ever created something from a shape like a circle and you just want to turn it into an outline. There you go. So the Pathfinder tool, very useful for creating things of all types. You may say, well, I don't get how that's useful. Well, how do I explain? Well, let's say you've got a circle and you want to create a moon shape. You could alt click and drag and then divide those lines, and you've got a moon shape right in the sky. Okay, you may say that's not you know, that's not that crazy, but there's all sorts of different ways that you can utilize these various different techniques to create interesting shapes and all sorts of stuff like that, and we'll get into that when we do the examples. So that's the Pathfinder tool. Let's take a look at some other little effects and things like that you can add to your illustration. So when we've got an object or a vector path that we've drawn with any of the tools selected, we can come up to effects. We have a lot of different effects up here, such as distort up here, where we can zigzag, and we can always preview this to see what the results are. So we can create a star shape, we can make it relative, absolute, we can change the amount of ridges. So if we wanted to create you know, the sun in some form, this could be useful for creating sun, or a plethora of other different distortions. So effect, distort, we can roughen the edges with this if we want something that's a bit more expanded, and you could see we could like take that roughened circle like so, duplicate it, make it a different color, you know, drag it around, create like these kind of explosion effects or something along those lines. So that's a way you can utilize some of these distorts and things of that nature. Pucker and bloat, there's all different ones you'll want to have a play around with, because as you can see from that, all I've done is create a circle. I've used pucker and bloat, and I can have this star shape, I can have this star shape. There's so many different ways that you can use the distortion and transform to just create original shapes from basic shapes and things of that nature. We can feather things, add drop shadows, inner glows, outer glows. If you want something to glow a little bit, we can change it into a scribble, you know, give it a scribbled texture, and we can adjust the width of strokes and make them less or more. We can change the curves and the variation of these things. So the tools and the effects are things you're really going to have to play around with. There's so many different ones, so many different ways to use them. Feathering the edges, you know, if you want to add a feather, and what that does is makes the edge just slightly transparent and feathered in rather than a hard circle. For yeah, there's just so many different effects. These artistic effects, I don't use them as much, but if you've got an image and you want to add like a certain kind of painted effect or something like that, or a stylized charcoal, I prefer to just create the vectors as they are. I don't usually use a lot of these stylized effects, but they can create varying different things on your photos to make them look kind of interesting, and you can incorporate that into your illustrations and all that good stuff. Another good one to note is warp, because you can use that to arch shapes, you can arc lower. So it's just another way of creating interesting distorted shapes or shapes from other things with great ease, which Illustrator does really well. So that's all your effects. There's some stuff probably in objects, you know, I've gone over your sort of perspective, envelope, distort, but there's other stuff to note. So if we have a look at some of that, you can join paths together. What that means is if you had, for instance, one path here and one path, no, sorry, I pressed escape there to get off the path. So if I have two separate paths like this, but they're not joined together, they're not going to be affected by the same thing, and they're not connected. I can join the paths by right clicking and clicking join, and it'll say to join you must select 2 endpoints of the same or different paths. So because it's not an endpoint, it did not like it, but because that is, it likes it. So if you have 2 endpoints, you can join those paths together to create a full shape, and that can be kind of useful, I guess. Yeah, so there's a lot of different stuff here. Some of the stuff is, like I say, expand appearance is always useful when you've drawn a stroke and you want to make that stroke into a fill, and that's about it for those, really, I think. Yeah, so down here you're just looking at maybe using it for perspective, and you may be looking at doing some stuff with expanding your strokes, but not a whole lot. So I think that's basically the basics, isn't it? I've gone over how you make a document. Shall we refer back and make sure I've covered everything? I've gone over how you make a document and what the color settings mean, what layers are and how we use layers, what the tools are, how they're used, strokes, brushes and fills. I've gone over the libraries as well as like things like the objects and effects, so symbols, distortion effects, artistic effects that you can use. So that's a lot of the basic stuff. Now this is going to be the useful part, because what we're going to do is now make some stuff with the knowledge that we've gained. Okay, now you can take a picture of yourself and you could start along with me and finish the pictures. You could create yourself in a Rick and Morty style, create yourself in this kind of coloured abstract style, create a realistic vector portrait using the techniques, or adventure time yourself into something completely crazy and cartoon. So now I'm going to go through each one of these, and I'm just going to show you the basics of how these sorts of styles are made, and then you can take the basics that you've learned from the tutorial and the basic stuff here, and you can crack on making awesome artwork and then show me what it looks like and say, hey, I did your tutorial and I made this. And then yeah, so let's get into the examples and how these are made. Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to go through these examples as promised, and we're going to use the basic techniques, tools and effects that I have taught you in this tutorial to create some of these fantastic examples. So let's start off with the first example, the ever popular cartoon Rick and Morty. It's very simple to create this style, but what I'm going to teach you as well is when we look at a style, how do we go, okay, this is how it's made. So we can see that all illustrations are made up of shapes, strokes and fills. Okay, so we can see that the strokes are very thin and a little bit wavy, and we can also see that we have this kind of light color palette that we can emulate, and a style we can emulate because they have very large circular eyes, specific types of eyebrows and hair and whatnot. So the first thing we note is that there is an ellipse or two for the eyes here on both characters. So what you'd want to do is create an ellipse, but you can see that the form of the eye is a little bit misshapen. Now there's several ways you can do anything in illustration in an Illustrator at any time. There's all different methods to getting the shapes you want. For instance, I could come in and edit this to be more akin to the shape of the eye using the point selection tool. So it's a little bit more flat at the top, a little bit more flat here, and it's a little bit misshapen. But you could also go into effects, you could distort it, and you could roughen it a little bit with really low settings. We'd want it less detailed, and we'd want it smooth because it's quite a smooth curve, and then just taking the size down will give us this kind of more messy effect. And obviously with that effect we can again try it with even less. So if we went down to 2 and change the detail and press OK, we'll get a different kind of misshapen shape. But for the purposes of this, it's fairly straightforward. Another way to do it would be to use the pencil tool, double click it, and you can change it so that it's more accurate or less accurate and smooths out the paths that you draw. This is especially useful if you use a mouth and you want to get a really smooth pencil line to stroke, or a really smooth lines with your mouse, or if you want to get accurate lines here. So for instance, I could change it to almost perfectly smoothing. I could look at the eye here and I could just draw a circle shape, and you can see because of the smoothing it will smooth the shape out for me. So for instance, if I wanted to just trace around the outline of the eye and fill it, I can do that. If this isn't quite right, as we said before, with the pencil tool we could redraw it, and there you're going to have the perfect kind of eye shape that you want. So first things first, let's make a head shape for these eyes, and as we can see it's a pretty straightforward oval shape but fairly misshapen. So we might not want to do it that way. We might want to create a rectangle, okay, and say the rectangle is the same size as the head, and we've got the proportions, and then we can use the point selection tool, drag this in here, click on the point, drag it in, drag this in, and you see just from a simple oval within a few clicks we've got a pretty uniform head shape for our Rick character. Now this works obviously if we're creating a very specific character, we want a very specific look, we need a very specific head shape. Now if we were just drawing our own character, we don't really need to bother with a very specific head shape. We can look at the basic shapes and create our own shapes based on that. If we look at this fill shape, we can see that it's fairly similar thickness and it's a little bit more blurred. So at the end of creating it, we may take it into Photoshop or we may blur it a little bit just to be more accurate to the fills and the strokes. So we've drawn one eye that's a similar shape. We can also save time by holding Alt and Shift and clicking and dragging. We can also transform, reflect and flip it vertical so that it is the same on both sides, and that just saves us time drawing them twice. Let's add a this is now behind this head shape, so we don't want that. Bring it to the front. Another trick with the Rick and Morty eyes, it's not very visible on this because it's not the most high res of pictures, but if I was to draw a little ellipses like so with a black fill, take the stroke off because we don't need it, and I'm just going to drag it in a tiny bit. This is a good place to use the roughen tool as well. If we go to Effect, Distort, Roughen and preview it, because they have these little jagged edges to the eyes, and this gives a pretty effective pupil shape. Because of the way I've just done it, it's too triangular because I couldn't see properly because it was on top of that. But if we go again, Distort, and we go to Roughen, preview it, and we can see, let's get a bit zoomed in so we can actually see what we're doing. Effect, Distort, Roughen, preview, and as you can see we've got these different shapes we can form. We can change it to absolute, get this crazy shape, but if we smooth it out, give it a bit more detail, a bit less size, that's better. Sometimes it's easier when you zoom in to get an idea of how things should look. So grab the pen tool, click and hold to drag, and then just click again. We can select this. We don't need a fill, so we can remove it. Wouldn't matter if we left it because it's the same color as the skin. The mouth, click, drag. There you go. Simple as that. And as you can see, you know, we don't have to draw over it, but as a beginner you may want to overdraw in order to get the correct shapes, curves, etc. And again, we don't have to we don't always have to redraw things. We can duplicate, transform, reflect vertically, and then we've got the other side without having to redraw that curve if we want to be lazy. Got these little bags under his eyes, so there we go. and drag. So you'll notice with this illustration, some of them you'll have variation on the lines, some of them you won't, because on this the lines, the strokes, are the very uniform strokes, and there's not a lot of variation on them. So everything stays basically the same stroke width for the entire illustration. And after the fact, if we want, we can click Alt as we drag these Beziers as well to just have them be more uniform. We can go into our point selection tool, alter them. We might want to get the this little blue, and then add our stroke again here. So as you can see, we've got that. Let's draw 2 circles for the ears. Well, not circles, semicircles, should we say. That's not quite right, so we draw it again. Click that with the eyedropper selection tool if you find that it's a bit in front and it shouldn't be. You can arrange it, send it to back, but because as we've got the reference on the same layer, we can just I'm pressing Control and open and close bracket or open bracket to send back and bring to front. As you can see, those are the shortcuts that you can press, or you can do it just by right clicking and arrange. Again, duplicate, holding Alt, clicking and dragging, arrange, and then we're gonna transform and then reflect it again. There you go. Drag that up. And his hair, it's a very specific shape, but as it's behind something, you don't necessarily always have to worry about being accurate because it's going to be hidden by the head. I'm just going to trace it because it's going to save me time getting this hair shape. So you can see in some of the lines, like here, the subtlety in the curve. So you hold and drag, you create the more subtle curve of the hair. If you want to be a bit more accurate in that manner, I'm just doing it really quickly because you'll get the idea effectively of how to do any kind of image in this style just from copying the head alone. It's that easy, basically. Drag this over here, align it, and let's send it to the back. So as you can see, we've got a pretty accurate head there. Let's look at these randomize. Drag that over, get rid of that spare line there. And you might say, well, yeah, it looks fairly accurate. What about the body? Pretty simple. Now, if you're drawing over it like this, like I say, it's cheating, but it's also known as overdrawing, and a ton of people do it. And we'll talk about that more when it comes to illustrating realistic portraits, because that is something where it's a little bit more important. I mean, obviously, for the purposes of this, anytime you want to draw a character, you can see I just drew a circle. Draw another circle. I don't quite like the shape, but it doesn't matter because I'm just showing you how easy it is to just make another character. Okay, so maybe his nose is more this way, and we want to get that stroke, and maybe his mouth's more, more like this. And we can alt click drag, scale that down. We've got a bottom lip shape, something like that, as I say. And because we've got that smoothing on, even if I'm using my mouse like I am right now, we get this fairly easily drawn curved shape without having to be too accurate about it. Just add those fills, send it behind the pupil. Again, for the ear, you could do the same thing as before, but in a different position, because we're just making up a character in the same style. You'll get the idea fairly quickly. I'm reflecting it to the other side again. You may want to extend this up. So if we use the point selection tool, you don't just have to select one point. We can hold Shift, click 2, drag that up, and now we've got 2. And say we're going to give him some hair because the characters have hair. I'll use this Boris Johnson, maybe. fill it yellow. Get yourself some Boris Johnson hair. Not the best character, but obviously I've done that in a minute or two just to show you how we can recreate these characters in the same style. Let's get that stroke. So as you can see, just from doing that, from figuring out the stroke and the fill, you can recreate your own characters in that style, and it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. So draw this lapel, duplicate it, transform, reflect. So now we've got the other lapel. We're going to want to draw a solid frame for the body. We can draw those upper lines in shortly. See, the problem there is as it's connecting to that point, it's on sometimes these things happen, so I just use my point selection tool to correct that. I can then make this white, make the fill white. So you see we have this, this fill shape. The problem is the way that I've drawn it a little bit. So I'm just going to fudge it together. It's not perfect, but for the purposes of this tutorial, it'll work fine. So grab that, drag it over. I can get rid of this one because we've duplicated it again. Again, holding Alt, dragging, that allows you to duplicate. I'm going to reflect it over. You would just draw either side individually probably, because you don't want it to be too symmetrical. Like I say, just showing you how it's done. Arrange, center back. Obviously I've got this in the way. Then we've got a body which we can drag down into place with his neck. So there we have a Rick and Morty character. So the things to note being again that these ears, so when we're like checking the details, we can see that this hair is in the way of these ears and we don't want that. We can also see the hair is too high because I wasn't paying attention when I placed it. So we have this like so. Let's scale it a little bit. So there you have Doc, right? Well, you have Morty, but it's Doc from Back to the Future, let's be honest. Do you want to see me create Morty? I mean, you can always skip through the video if you don't. Much more circular head. So again, like if you're drawing, say, a picture of yourself and you're recreating a style, you may want to look at certain characters, what shapes their head, what's their hairstyle look like in that style. And it may give you a good idea of how to redraw yourself in this style and keep it accurate. I don't have to necessarily redraw the eyes again, that would be pointless. I can just reuse these ones because they are basically the same. You see, just scaling it up, and there we go. Just bring it to front, transform, reflect. Okay. It's a bit closer over here. We've then got this like circular cartoon nose, like so. It's got a little wry smile. Again, his ears, very similar ears. Why waste time when it's just a tutorial? You can see they're a little bit, maybe a little bit larger and lower down at an angle, but using the exact same ears from another character, we can still get the accurate enough results. Let's look at his hair. Just overtrace it. And you see the problem with that is it's almost too smooth because get that pencil tool, because we've got the smoothness turned on. So let's turn that down. Let's make it more accurate to what I'm drawing with the mouse. See how that turns out. Okay, just connect that up. If you've missed a bit, again, you can redraw over it like so. Let's get the brown, let's get the black stroke, bring it over here, arrange and send to back. But again, got my my stuff in the wrong place, on the wrong layers. Eyebrow, blummy neck. Copy it over, transform, reflect, yes. So his eyes may be a little bit different shaped, maybe a little bit more like and then if you wanted to draw the body again, pretty straightforward stuff. Arm, give the arm a give it a fill of yellow, and it's really more of a little opaque yellow, so we can double click, try and match that yellow up, and then let's do another arm. This will be going below. Fill it up. Good stuff. Okay. See, the problem is we want to drag that up because it's going to go below the head. Arrange center back, then bring it in front of the example, and then it'll just be a matter of, as we say, you can pick the pencil tool, you can pick the pen tool, whatever you like, really up to you. The difference being, if I use the pencil tool, it's going to be quicker, but maybe a little less accurate. We don't want that. See what it's doing? This is a little bit too close perhaps, so it's like redrawing it, plus it's selected, so make sure that's deselected. There we go, and that's not very good. Let's correct that. Still not good. Let's correct it again. I wanted to use my mouse instead of my tablet, you know, because not everybody has a tablet, so sometimes it's good to show you how it's done without one. So with this, you know, if we fill it, it's not going to look quite right, but we can just fill underneath. I mean, we can see there's bits that could be better, but still, there you go. You get the idea. I could duplicate that down, duplicate it down, duplicate it, scale it, rotate it, and all that good stuff. And then just whacking these details in as quick as I can so we can move on to the next example. But I've started, so I'll finish. Obviously, if you're drawing without overtracing, you're going to have to think things through. You're going to have to think about the posing, about the lines, whatever, or the placement of these lines. Click away, click, click. then this one here needs a stroke, and so does that one, because they vanished for some reason. And yeah, we're basically done. It'll just be a matter of filling those arms with some colour, and we'll have our Morty. Okay. So, see, we've got the arms drawn here. Click those, bring them over, put them behind the shirt, which we didn't do. Edit. What the f is going on here? Arrange, center back. We can't do that because of that. Clicking these points, I'm just going to get them. It's the perfectionist, my inner perfectionist there, even in a tutorial. I have to make sure that it doesn't look completely awful. So let's put fills in for this hand and all that good stuff. I'm just tracing it with the pencil tool. You can use the pen tool, clicking. Obviously I'm missing some points here. I'm gonna have to go back maybe and like draw these back in, but for the purposes of this you get the idea. Don't need a stroke. We don't want to send it fully to back because we've got certain things in front. What we could do is say grab this finger, fill it, and give it a stroke. Okay, that still needs to go back one. Let's just do the arm real quick. I'll just show you with the pencil tool. See, I'd lock the upper layer because I don't want to click the other strokes underneath as I'm drawing in the colour. I'm just retracing the stroke I've drawn. I can see that finger is not quite right, but like I say, I'm just showing you the techniques. Okay, what have we got? So we want them on this in the same group of layers. We want them in the same group of layers, and we want to drag it below, or I'll send it further back, shall we say. Last thing left to do is going to go underneath the hands, and it's going to be like, see the problem there? Can you see the problem is that it wasn't locked, so it selects the stroke layers. That is not what I want. Let's correct this. Who cares? Fill it with a black, probably just a slightly greyed black. We're going to unlock the layer, drag it in. Come on. Sometimes we're a bit temperamental about being sent to the back. That can be because it's sort of grouped up, so you need to pull it out. Anyway, you can see that there's the reason it doesn't look very Morty-esque for the most part is because the eyes are much closer together. And then, as I say, you might, because they are these kind of cartoons, might grab it, go into effect, distort, no, sorry, effect, stylize. I think if there is a blur, I think there is somewhere. I'd usually take it into there we are. I'd usually take it into Photoshop to do like after production stuff like this, but just for the sake of the fact that it's an Illustrator tutorial, if there was a blur, it'd be very slight. So let's just see what this looks like. So you can see it's blurred it a little from this, maybe a little bit too much. Where's his hand gone? We had a hand, no we don't. I'm guessing that's because it's not on the right layer. How unusual. Is it locked somewhere? That's the question. No. Anyway, never mind. But yeah, you could take I really don't get why this isn't like you know, these programs. This is what you fucking get with them. Should I say flipping? Why is it not duplicating? I can drag it, sure. I can drag it on its own. Oh, but no. No, if I want to copy it over without that, of course not. See what I mean? What's the point? What you do? You copy everything but this arm. And the arm is still looks like it's still there. You're just changing the layer. It's things like this really get on your wick. I've got no idea what's going on here. I'll go right to the top. It'll still be anyway, there it is. It's not where I want it. Still needs to go higher. Again, I don't know why it didn't just duplicate it over, but if you do, feel free to put it on a postcard and send it to me so I can not read it. But anyway, the point was that we can take it into Photoshop and blur it, or we can blur it in here, or we could try and like roughen it. Not that much, obviously. Smooth. Less detail, more details, you know, just to show you how these work. That's like a whole other level of wiggle to it. So you can blur it, you can add some roughness to it. But that's the basics of making any Rick and Morty character. Is circular eyes. Everything's got a 1 pt stroke, and it just looks pretty simplified, pretty plain. So that's example 1. And now let's move on to example 2. So if I just rearrange my layers real quick. Let's look at the next example, the Adventure Time example here. Okay, now this one, it may look more complicated than the Rick and Morty ones, but it's very much the same process. Again, you're just going to use strokes, but the only difference really is that we're going to use the width tool. If you've not got a brush with pressure sensitivity, then you're going to want to use the width tool on this one. So this is a bit more abstract, but again, works in exactly the same fashion. As we can see, oval shape. Here, everything's made up of fills and strokes. As you'll remember, I said that at the start of this. If you want no fill, you can see if you've got the shape right. So we've got that oval there. Let's zoom in. What shape's this? It's another ellipses. Oh, cancel. So we've got an oval, an ellipses, oh, and another ellipses. Okay. Now we just need to draw this mouth shape. I'm just going to click and drag from the center. Okay. Take off the fill because I need to draw a tongue. Like so. Alt and click will remove that section of the Bezier and allow me to just create a pointed angle. So that's a good thing, good point to remember when creating these illustrations. Tooth and another two teethers. Obviously, I could use the duplication to speed it up. Shrink it down a little bit, and there you go. Teeth. I want to make sure that we get the stroke right. I'd also say on this you're going to want rounded caps on everything. Make more sense. If you've got stray paths like this, bring it in. I'm going to grab this tongue colour. And what stroke did we have for this? 2PT. So we were on 1 last time, now we're on 2. Let's get the mouth colour, give it a stroke of 2, bring it. Oh, we didn't fill these with white. That's a rookie mistake there on my part. Move it up, click, drag, okay. So we have this oval shape here. We can see it's not completely accurate, but we can adjust the Bezier handles at will after the fact. We know it's got a 2PT stroke. We know it's got this fill, but it's also got this half moon shape here. So what if I copy and I go to paste in place? That only pasted that section because it wasn't properly selected. Paste in place, so now we've got 2 ovals of the exact same kind, and then paste in place again. Now we've got 3. Drag 1 over here and resize it to fit the curve here, and then select these 2, and we can minus front, and that gives us this shaded bit really easily. Grab that, fill it, add a stroke, make the stroke 2PT, and then make sure that that's behind everything, which it isn't, but it will be. So as you can see, it's pretty much spot on, apart from this needing to have a stroke around the outside. Now there's various different ways we could do that, but for this I'm just going to scale it in a little bit. Okay, so as you can see, using that over tracing technique, same one from Rick and Morty, you could do that. Now what if you want to create your own version, right? Well, it's just gonna be exactly the same. 2PT fill, 2PT stroke, same kind of fills. Oh, good lord, same kind of eye shapes. You know, same kind of. You could just have that as the mouth, yeah, sure, if you wanted. Look, I mean, you can just even do that. Get the fill tool, make that red, have no teeth, whatever you want. You know, you could add your own nose if you wanted, and then you've got a whole different style of your own that you're making. Just rotate it, and we've got a different kind of nose. Maybe we try scaling it. It gives us a different nose. Maybe we move it around. Maybe his nose is up here. You know, all of these things are possible with Adobe Illustrator. And again, super simple. You know, super simple. Two-tone shading, etc. And obviously it helps when you've got a guide of some kind like this to reference. But I'm not going to, I don't think I'm going to draw the full thing. I mean, you get the idea. There's no point sitting here watching me trace the Adventure Time people as well as the Rick and Morty people. But basically you get the idea. And the other thing I was saying about the width tool, because like on here you can see there's just slight width variation with things like the head part. So if I remove examples and like I'm drawing his little head part, and that would be a separate section. Have to bear with me here. Transform, I'll just do this dead quick so I can show you the variation. What colour and how far apart are we talking? It's like a creamy colour, isn't it? Creamy. Let's grab the pen tool and connect these two sections here. Arrange centre back. Extend these down a little. It's like a creamy colour. So let's start at a yellow and get a creamy kind of colour going on. I don't think that's it's not the colour we're looking for. Black 2pt. So all I mean by that is, like, you can see it's a bit thicker on this side, a bit thinner on this side. Generally the thickness would be where it is closest to the person looking at the image. Say we grab this width tool and we know it's 2pt because we've made it 2pt, but we can just drag it slightly out and give it a little bit of extra thickness. We can zoom in and do that and see how thick it goes. As you can see, we can also use the width tool to create very different styles of art in that sense. We could use it on this stroke as well if we wanted, and make our own version of the style in that sense. So there you go. That's using the width tool and strokes, and that's how you would take the same exact style of making an illustration, but for a different style of cartoon or illustration. It's the same thing. So for this, we just did a 1 pixel stroke because we look at that and we go, that's a really thin stroke, right? So it's either going to be 0.5 or it's going to be a 1. With this, we look at it, we go, that's a thicker stroke. We've got these thicker strokes, so we know that it's going to be about 2 or 3 pt. We notice that there's variation, so we can copy the variation. We notice that the eye shapes are different, but that is very unique to the style, so we can copy that to copy the style. And also just the colouring. So this is completely flat colour, a little bit of gradient on some of the background stuff. And with this, it's more of a two-tone shading, where there's like these little shadows for parts like on the bag here, on the side of his head, on the eyes here. So that is Rick and Morty, and that is showing you how, again, we use the exact same techniques to make this. Now with these two, these are 100% over traced. Like, there's different methods you can use. I'm not going to grab my tablet right now, but like if I want, I could sketch out the head basically from a drawing in pencil, bring it in, over trace the pencil, and it makes it a more of an original piece of art, because some people would say, oh well, if you've just traced a picture, anyone can do that, whatever. Yeah, it's cheating. It's not necessarily the best way to learn art in any way, but if you want to be a vector artist, a lot of them do it, and you'll see it. If they look very accurate to the face, a lot of the time it is over traced in some form. This Downey Jr. one is probably more definitely over traced, and this one probably is too, but it's the difference in style that you can look at, and how the same techniques that we've learned in this tutorial can be applied to multiple different things. So whether that's making Rick and Morty or some sort of Adventure Time style artwork, we can also create this kind of abstract artwork, or this Robert Downey Jr. style artwork. So let's take these two examples and bring in some images. Oh, not on that layer. So, you know, just as an example, maybe for some over tracing and how that works, we'll look at these and we'll look at these. And obviously this is a little girl. We don't have to use a little girl. We can still, the same effects can still apply. So say I want to create this Robert Downey Jr. I mean, I could still use this quite cool color palette. I could use the background idea, or I can completely change it. That's part of the fun of it when it comes to, sorry, just 1 second. No, I don't even remember opening that. So yeah, we can change the style of it, or it can stay the same fundamentally. So now I'm going to get into how we illustrate Robert Downey Jr. Okay, so when we're doing a more realistic portrait like this one, the main difference is going to be the fills mostly, and the techniques on these elements here. You'll notice a few things. So for instance, there's in the color spectrum, there's the highlights, there's the midtones, there's some shadow, and then there's these darker elements of shadow here to add sort of stylization. They've also used a very curved, everything's very curved, there's no straight lines, so that's specific of the technique, as well as the color. And again, in the hair we have like the darker parts, the midtones, and then the highlights, and there's a little bit of touch of gradients to some of it as well to add an extra layer of depth. Again, I'm not going to do the whole thing, I'll be here all day, but basically you take the image and you may want to take the opacity down so that you can actually see what you're creating on top of it. You can use a different color if you prefer for the strokes and things like that at first, so you can see easier what you're drawing. But as you can see, the eyebrow. Now you might be wondering, like, how do they get these kind of details here? And we'll want an accurate pencil tool. You can do it with a pen tool, you can do it with the pencil tool. So let's look at two different ways of possibly doing it. You see, I'm just controlling the curve, I'm picking out the shape, but I'm also sort of adding some elements, some touches of curve that might not be there to get like a kind of an interesting shape. Grab that fill. Now you can see, because it's not as smooth as you might like because of the accuracy. So we know that the accuracy needs to be higher, maybe here, maybe here. But we can also come in after the fact with the smooth tool, and we can just smooth out any parts we would like smoother. And that can be a really useful tool to know as well when creating these kind of things. Pencil tool. Again, just rushing for the purposes of the tutorial to show you the techniques. So you've got these eyebrows. What about the eyes? You know, what about the nose? And you can see he's picking out specific shadows. So if we look at it from a perspective of like, well, what's the darkest parts? We don't have to use the pencil tool. We can use this pen tool to get a really accurate curve around the nose here. We can see it kind of maybe loops back on itself. We can add a touch of style. Curve that out there. And do the same for this section. For the nostril, got a goatee, obviously. I think the goatee is a bit unusual over here. Not sure why. Maybe it's meant to be part of the pose or look or whatever. You can see I'm just using the mouse here, just tracing the shape around. More beard. Plenty of goatee is a staple of Downey Jr.'s face. As you can see, we've got that kind of fill shape. I mean, I really don't know how much of this you want to see. You want to see the whole thing? Well, that might be a whole other tutorial, because I'm pretty sure this tutorial's already at around an hour. Which is longer than most tutorials, I think. I'm not even sure if I'll have to split it into parts or not. But I suppose what I could do is show you these basic techniques as far as I can be bothered. And I can always go deeper into detail if you want to see a full video, you want to see me finish it. Just to give an example of the fills, for instance. I mean, if I'm going to do it accurately, if it's not for the purposes of a tutorial, I'm going to layer it up properly so that, you know, all of the, say, hair is on one layer, like so. Maybe the face fill is on another layer. That way I can lock them up and I don't edit them, and then I can go in and draw beneath or on top. So, you know, for this I could just draw similar shapes that he's got here, or I can take the head down, look at it, where's the highlight. So say the highest of the highlights here, add some those touches of jagged edge. This is not a well-drawn curve by any means. It's not going to be within the constraints of the face that I've already drawn, but it'll do. So let's say that's a highlight there. And for some reason I cannot see the differential myself. Make it brighter. Why? Oh, because I'm drawing it on the wrong layer. Another rookie mistake. So it's actually too bright. So there's like a highlight layer on the head. Can't see it super well, but you get the idea. What if we want to draw in the shadows? So he's got kind of a heavy shadow like down here. We could fill in like so, fill it this mid-tone colour, bring it behind. Maybe it's a little bit too dark. Maybe I want this lighter. Colour for now. But yeah, you get the idea. We could spend all day drawing in these jagged shapes, or we could draw in curved, smooth shapes, whatever floats your boat stylistically. I don't really like the idea of having that be the highlight, and I can change that if I want. It doesn't have to be accurate to the photo, it can be whatever looks better. I can also, if I wanted, I could come in and maybe reduce the opacity, get like a 3-tone effect. So yeah, you get the idea. You know, I want to draw the hair in layers, drawing the darkness of the hair, blah blah blah, then drawing the next layer, then drawing the next layer, build up those details on top. That is the basics of building up those portraits. As I say, if you want to see more detail, I'll go into more detail in a full video, but I'm not gonna crack on with the entire portrait because it'll take me about another hour. Same thing with this though. You want to overtrace it, you want to create a similar style. You might draw the whole thing in sections, you might break it up into chunks, do everything in angular. So say like this hair here, it's very, everything's at an angle, there's no curves. And it's all about the colours and the shapes and how they kind of combine into each other. Let's grab this purple, let's grab some of this blue. Grab some blue, grab a bit more of this black. Send that bad boy to the back, not that far back, and yeah, we just go about bringing in these elements of colour. I mean, I did add a curve there, that's my force of habit because I'm more of a curve guy than a cubism guy, but you get the idea. We can just keep drawing in different colours, over tracing the illustration, and build it up in these smaller parts. You know, there's some of these like bits of flair. You could use the pen tool or the pencil tool, and just as you're drawing with the pencil tool, it's freehand, right? But if you hold shift, you can draw straight lines. So you draw a straight line, a straight line, a straight line, and I'm holding shift to keep the straight lines, but I'm letting go and clicking again to make those new connections. That's if I wanted to do it with the pencil tool. If I wanted to do it this, like these pinks here, and you could draw, you don't have to draw them at the right size. Like this pink stuff here, you could select it, scale it, duplicate it, pull them together, scale it again maybe, rotate it, and you'll have like that kind of effect, you know. So yeah, as I say, many ways to skin a cat, many ways to do varying different styles, and I hope this helps any of you who are a beginner learn some interesting techniques, learn how to illustrate some stuff, and get a handle on the basics of Adobe Illustrator. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it helped you learn a few things. If it did, feel free to give the video a like and subscribe. If you want to see further tutorials, whether it's an intermediate tutorial going through different things that you're curious to know about Illustrator or any other of the Adobe Creative Suite, or you want to see further examples of how to illustrate specific things, let me know, because obviously now that the beginner's tutorial is done, I can move on to doing some of the more intricate stuff in more detail. But I want to know from you, the audience, what you want to see. So I hope this tutorial helped if you did watch it, and thanks very much for watching. I'll be back soon with another tutorial. Have a great day.